Hey everyone, I hope we all are doing well. This time I would like to make a guide for the third run of the Nations Cup World Series 2025, which takes place at Autopolis with some specified cars you can already see on the left hand side. So for this race you can only use the Audi R8 LMS Evo, the Ferrari 458 GT3, the Lamborghini Huracan, the Honda NSX, and lastly the Renault RS01. And here on this page you can also see the race settings which will be used for the third run of the Nations Cup at Autopolis here. And you can also see that the qualifying session will only last for 6 minutes. So technically you might be able to have 2 chances to set your qualifying lap. So for example, you set an out lap, then you set your qualifying lap, and then you go back to the pits and then you rejoin the track once again in order to set your final attempt of during the qualifying session. And the race itself will also not really last, but you have to lap this track for 30 laps, which is also quite long. And this is something you're also about to see during the race simulation chapter at the end of this video. Not really at the end, but it's like the last chapter which I will be trying to talk about during this video. And there's also something else which is quite interesting for this race. And you can already see there that the start type, right, like the start type for this race is a grid start with a false start check. So this is already an opportunity where you can already lose or gain a lot of positions depending on how your race start is like. Because with a false start check, it's really tempting to, once the lights go out, that you can also react to it as soon as possible or literally immediately in order to potentially overtake few other drivers right in front of you. But obviously if you do it a bit too quickly, then you will jump the start and in the end serve a penalty in the end, which is not ideal. As for the tire wear multiplier as well as the fuel consumption rate, which will be used for the race here. So the tire wear rate for both the qualifying session as well as for the race is set to *2, and the fuel consumption rate is set to *1. So in terms of the fuel rate or like the fuel consumption, I can already spoiler alert a little bit about the fuel itself during the race. So you don't have to save fuel. So even though we have to lap the circuit for 30 times, we don't have to save fuel. But other than that, we will also be using custom slipstream. There's no mandatory pit stop required, but with 30 laps and us using the soft tires only, we have to pit at least once during that race. But in this video I would like to talk about the track, showing my best lap, talking about the track limit penalties, and lastly also showcasing a race simulation run I did earlier. In order for you to start your qualifying lap or even your time trial lap really well, it's quite important to place your car on the outside of the penultimate corner as much as possible, so that once you come back from the outside line back to the apex of the penultimate corner, you can also try to carry even more speed, and this will also help you when you want to start your qualifying lap or even your time trial lap. And this is also the driving line I wanted to showcase you here, which you're also supposed to take in order to start your lap really well. Now we approach one of the most difficult corners at the circuit, which is turn 1 in my opinion. Because the braking point into that corner, like even though you see the 100 braking marker on the left hand side, I didn't use that as my braking reference, but I used the orange berry on the left hand side as my braking reference, but even slightly after that. And you also don't really see the entry or like the apex of that corner because it is blind, and because of that it's really difficult to nail turn 1 consistently. But now we also approach the first corner of sector 2, and the braking point I used for the first corner of sector 2 was just before the 50 braking marker on the left hand side, which you can also see up there. But once you use that as your braking reference, you can still miss the entry of the first corner of sector 2 a bit easily there. And the driver line you have to take through these kind of section is you have to take the inside curb but then you also have to come from a wider line into that corner. And if you do that, then you can also try to carry as much speed as possible before approaching the hairpin here. You have to stay really closely to the apex here by also trying to carry as much low speed or like corner speed as possible. And also for this corner here, you also have to use the curb on the left hand side, but if you try to be on the throttle a bit too early, you can also run off the track quite easily, and this is something you also should be aware of. And now the braking point into the next hairpin is, you can already see the first, arrow on the right hand side, right? So I was braking just right after that, and also try to take like a V-shape entry, because you have to stay on the inside curb here, or like the corner here. You can also use that as your rotation. Apply the throttle as early as you can, so that you can also try to have a really good exit. Now we also approach the second corner of sector 3, and I was using the 50 braking marker on the left hand side as my braking reference, but on the very same time I was also trying not to brake too hard, because this way I also wanted to keep the weight transfer kind of alive in that sense. Because if I was braking too hard, then I would also put a lot of weight to the front and the car wouldn't turn in the end. And here it's also really important to carry as much speed as possible with this driving line I'm pretty much showcasing here. But here you can also try to shift down to the first gear to have a slightly better rotation. Use the curbs as much as you can here. And here it's also really important, like it kind of invites you to run wide, but for the next corner, like the penultimate corner, you want to come from a wider line into the entry here, so that you can also try to carry as much speed as possible in order to finish your qualifying lap or even your time trial lap really well. And now I also would like to showcase you the best lap I've done so far. I'm thinking about maybe trying to give it another go, because I'm not really satisfied with my sector 3, but on the very same time I also would like to showcase you my best sector 1, and then I will catch you back on the track limit penalties. the first corner where you can actually receive a track limit penalty is the exit of the final corner, or like the inside of the final corner, because if you cut that curb a bit too much, for instance, like you battling with somebody else and going through that corner side by side and him trying to push you off a little bit too much there, you can receive a half a second penalty there. But the next one is this corner, because if you run off the track a bit too much here, even though that gives you dirty tires for the following corner, you will still receive a half a second time limit penalty. And the area where you can also serve your track limit penalties is this section here. So please watch out for those kind of corners, especially during the race, but also for the qualifying session. As you can see here, I was using the custom race mode in order to simulate my race, but unfortunately I wasn't able to adjust the settings in that way, while I was also able to use the false grid start check, because in the custom race mode you can only select between the rolling start and the grid start, which I was using in this race simulation here instead. So as you can see here, you have to lap the circuit for 30 laps, or like for 30 times, which is quite long, because as you were able to see, the best lap time I was doing earlier, which was like a 1 minute 43 lap time ish, it's not really that short, right? Because if you look at the lap time, it's already pretty decent in terms of the duration, or like the distance. But on the very same time, if you also have a look on the race distance here instead, which is 30 laps, then yeah, that will tell you that the race itself is going to last for a very long time. But I can also try to, recall or like repeat the race settings, which I've also talked about at the beginning of this video. So the tire wear multiplier has been set to ×2, and also the fuel consumption rate has been set to ×1. And you will also able to see throughout this video that the fuel consumption won't be an issue, no matter what kind of car you will be using here. So you don't have to worry about saving fuel in this race. However, you have to worry about your tires, because we are using the soft tire compound, and at this circuit you have so many fast changing corners, which will take a lot from the tires themselves. So because of that, it's really beneficial to maybe even look after your tires. And there are also a few corners at the circuit where you can also try to steer a little bit less in order to reduce the tire temperature, in my opinion. Like the penultimate corner is a really good example, or like the last corner in sector 2, like the long left-hander before you're about to finish sector 2 there. So because of that, I was like, okay, let's see how the tire wear would look like on the soft tire compound. And in this race simulation run, I can also try to spoiler alert it once again, which is I was trying to do a one-stop in this race because I just wanted to see how the tire wear would look like. And obviously, as I've also done one simulation run here, you shouldn't really try to take my lap times as a reference, because if I had done it again, then I'm pretty sure that I would have been able to go even faster than that, because with race simulation run you would also have fuel on board, and because of that the behavior of the car changes ever so slightly once again compared to the time trial one, because you don't really have fuel on board there. But if I was doing another race simulation run, I'm sorry, then I think I could have driven a little bit better here. But in this case, or like in this example, I really wanted to try and see how the tire wear would look like. So you can already see from my driving itself that the steering input is like less than the time trial one, and even the gear usage I was using here through almost every single corner was also slightly different, because I was also trying to downshift a little bit later than usual, because this way I wanted to keep the rear tires in a better condition, or also in a better shape. I'm sorry that I cannot speak English properly anymore, but because this way, like, if you can downshift a little bit later than what you would normally do in a time trial session, you would also reduce the amount of engine brake, which you would normally apply once you brake into a corner. But this way, like if you reduce the engine brake, then the rear tires, especially like in this case, as we can only use MR cars or like some specified MR cars in this race, the rear tires would also not really stop rotating quicker, but instead they would also head into the corner a little bit smoother, if you know what I mean. And this way I was also trying not to rotate the car a bit too much, even though I was using +5 brake balance settings, because for me personally I felt like the most comfortable settings I could use for both the qualifying session but also for the race, because this way the car could also rotate, even though I said earlier I didn't want to have as much rotation in this race in order to help the tire wear in this case here. But if I was using some other brake balance settings such as +2 or even 0, then I felt like the car wasn't really turning into the corner anymore. So because of that I was still using +5 in this race simulation run. But I think like throughout this video you can also see that when I was using, let's say when I was doing the one-stop strategy here, like the first stint lasted for 14 laps, and automatically or like logically speaking I would do 16 laps for the final stint. If you're wondering why I wasn't doing 15-15 because it's like symmetrical, that's because if you start the race, then you would also have 100% fuel on board. So that means that you would automatically have a bit more weight on your car once the race starts. But throughout the race you're also burning fuel automatically, and this way your car will also become a little bit lighter in the end. And the lighter your car is, the better it is for your tires, or like for your tire wear in general. So because of that I wanted to see how the tire would look like if I was doing 14 laps first and then finishing the race on 16 laps instead. Because the less weight I would have on the car, then it would also help the tire wear in the end. But you are about to see on this video that let's say if you want to do, I'm sorry, like if you want to do a one-stop strategy in this race, you have to drive really smoothly. Like it doesn't have to be like if you're thinking about, okay, let's start the race aggressively and maybe after lap 3 or 4 I can try to start driving a bit smoother in order to save the tires and for me being able to do one stop in this race still, that's not going to work, because you have to start the race, let me try to rephrase myself once again. You have to be committed, like really committed from the very beginning in order to drive so smoothly in order to save your tires. I think if I was doing another race simulation once again, maybe I could have had slightly better tires, but this is something I would have needed to find out. But because of that I will already recommend you guys not really going for a one-stop strategy, but for going for a two-stop strategy instead. Because if you want to do a two-stop strategy, then you can do like 10-10-10, like only doing 10 laps on these tires, and this way you can also try to be a bit more aggressively you can also try to be a bit more aggressively at the start, like from the very beginning of the race, and this way you also don't really have to worry about your tires. I mean, you still have to look after your tires just a tiny bit, but if you want to do a two-stop strategy in the end, you don't have to look after these tires as much as I was doing in this race simulation run here. And I also don't really know how much the pit stop time is going to be for the actual race, because if it's going to be shorter than in this race simulation run, then doing the two-stop strategy is even quicker, or like even better in the end. For me personally, it would have been really nice to see the one-stop being viable here, because it kind of reminds me back of the Gran Turismo Sport Top 16 Superstars race, which we had here with the Group 2 cars. And in that race you were able to do two strategies. So the first one being is that you were doing a one-stop. Like the race back then was also like much shorter than this one here. Or the other strategy was, which I was doing back then, a no-stop. But if you wanted to do a no-stop in that race, you really had to be gentle with your tires, because otherwise you wouldn't have made it in the end, or like till the end of the race. So yeah, this is something I was also kind of wishing to see here once again. I think you can also try to do it still, because with the one stop, what is it? It's a bit safer in the end, that you don't really have to worry about being stuck inside the traffic, because you also don't really know how much the other drivers are going to try and battle against each other on the track, because once they try to start battling or like fighting against each other, they will also start losing a lot of time by doing so. And this is maybe something you can also try to use for your own advantage while being on the other strategy, which is the one-stop strategy in this case. But nevertheless, I would still try not to recommend it for those of you who struggle a little bit by saving tires. And this is also something you don't really have to worry about for this race especially, because I think potentially 95% out of the entire participants, they are probably going to do the two-stop strategy in this race. And this way you can also maybe try to think about something else in this case once again. So if everybody's committed to do a two-stop strategy, like I was also suggesting earlier that you can maybe do 10-10-10, you can also maybe try to think about something else. Like if you want to do like a huge undercut, you can also try to go into the pits by the end of lap 8 even, or maybe even lap 7. Obviously your second stint has to be a little bit smoother in order to save your tires there. Or maybe lap 7 is a bit too early, but let's say if you want to pit at the end of lap 8, you can do that. Then you can also maybe try to finish your other stints by doing, wait, let me not calculate wrongly, like 11 laps instead. It should be fine, right? Yeah. So yeah, I think if you want to do a two-stop strategy in this race, it will also give you plenty of opportunities to maybe try to play around with the stint duration itself. So yeah, from my side, the race itself is also going to be really, really interesting to watch. And there's also something else I probably forgot to mention at the beginning of this video, because in this race, custom slipstream will be used once again. So because of that, I think we might be able to see lots of overtaking potentially at the circuit. Like dirty air is probably going to be reduced by a lot. And as you also have the long start-finish straight line here, you can also try to use that as an advantage to maybe try to go for an overtake. And as for the overtake opportunities at the circuit, obviously it's turn 1, like if you have the slipstream you can maybe go for a move into turn 1, but also if you want to stay behind the driver in front of you by going into turn 1, you can also maybe try to have a better exit in order to go for a move before the entry of the first corner in sector 2, which is this one here. Then the other overtaking opportunities, which you can maybe try to use that for your own race, is at the end of sector 2, like before the second hairpin at the circuit. And I think these are like the main overtaking opportunities you might be seeing in your own race, or like even in general. Obviously there are also like plenty other corners where you can still try to go for a move, but if you do that, then you will potentially end up losing a lot of time. So for example, if you have a really good exit here and you want to try and overtake the driver in front of you, I mean, you can still go for it, but because of the following right-hander being so tight and also quite fast, you're going to lose a lot of time through there. And this is also one of those corners where if you want to go side by side there's a high probability where somebody else would just go off the track due to a contact between the two of you. So this is maybe a corner I wouldn't maybe recommend. Maybe it's the same for this corner here, because normally, as I mentioned it on the track limit penalties earlier, like if you go side by side into that corner, then the driver on the outside, like not on the outside, on the inside, can be forced a bit off by the other driver, so that he has to cut the last corner and thus receives a half a second track limit penalty. So because of that, I would only recommend the other 3 overtaking spots I was talking about earlier. So it's the end of turn 1, the end of the end of turn 1, before you also approach turn 2, which is this corner here, and lastly, at the end of sector 2, before you approach the hairpin. Like, these are the 3 main overtaking spots you might go for in your own race. But apart from that, I think that's mainly it from my side. Obviously, I wish I could have also tested the other cars as well, such as the Ferrari, the Honda, Renault, and the Audi. But due to the lack of time I was having recently, I was trying to go with the Huracan here because it seems like it's the best car for this race. But I think you can still use the other cars in this race because they are not bad in my opinion. They are still really, really good. But I think the Huracan just managed to outclass them a little bit by being a bit more stable and also still having the necessary rotation into some of these corners. But yeah, but I think that's mainly it from my side. If I forgot to talk anything about this race which you wanted to know about, please let me know during the comment section here below. I mean, on the previous videos I wasn't able to comment on your guys' comments, or like, no wait, let me rephrase myself once again. Like, I wasn't able to reply to your comments from the previous videos, which I also intend to do hopefully either today or tomorrow. But for this video here, because this is quite important, I still intend to reply as soon as possible so that you guys can use that knowledge and also that information for your own benefit for your race tomorrow. And because of that, I also would like to wish you all the best. Hopefully you guys will have a really good race, an amazing race, a really enjoyable race, because in the end we should all enjoy what we have been doing so far here, and which is also like having some nice battles on the track, or if you also want to win your race comfortably, right? So I would like to wish you all the best, and from my side I also want to wish you a really nice day, and hopefully I'll be able to see you guys on the next one. So until then, have a good one everyone, and cheers!